A few years ago, I graduated in the top 5% of my university, and I wasn't studying 12 hours a day. I didn't have to sacrifice my social life. I wasn't cramming in my revision for exams. It was all a relatively smooth and stress-free process because I was studying smart. I was studying efficiently. So a lot of people have this idea that in order to achieve incredibly high grades, you need to be studying all the time, and you need to sacrifice all other areas of your life in order to achieve them. But that's just not the case. And in this video, I'm going to go through the exact study strategies that I use so that I only had to study about 6 hours a day to get really good grades because I was studying so efficiently. Start revising earlier, much earlier. If you take anything away from this video, it's this. The single easiest way to achieve higher grades with little to no stress is to start revising earlier. And this might mean you need to change the way you think quite drastically, because when I advise you to start revising earlier for your exams, I don't mean just a few days earlier, but I mean weeks or sometimes even months earlier. There are a few occasions where if I knew a particularly rigorous exam was coming, I would start studying for it up to 3 months before the actual day. Now, I wouldn't do this for every exam, but my point is that I would start revising for an exam weeks before virtually any other student. So I wasn't having to cram in my revision the week of the exam. It's simple, right? Just start revising earlier. The barrier that most students come across is they don't feel any pressure to study because their exams are so far away. And so my advice to you is implement self-imposed time constraints to essentially artificially add that pressure and urgency. And we're going to talk more about self-imposed time constraints later on in the video. Test yourself constantly. This is something that I was doing all the time throughout university, and there have been numerous studies showing that self-testing is essential when it comes to improving academic performance. So in one of the studies, University of Louisville psychologist Keith Line taught an identical statistics course to two groups of university students. In the first group, the students were asked to complete a short quiz at the end of each lecture. In the second group, the students didn't have to complete any quizzes, and at the end of the course, the students in the first group, so the students that had to complete a short quiz after every lecture, significantly outperformed the second group in every single exam. Just a short quiz at the end of each lecture forced the students to recall the information that they had just learned in the lecture, therefore reaffirming the knowledge in their long-term memory. So when you are studying, don't just read your textbook passively or take notes in class without even thinking about it. Study smart by quizzing yourself on the key concepts, particularly at the end of a study session or at the end of a lecture. Eliminate pseudo-studying. Now, I just mentioned that you should start revising earlier rather than just cramming a few weeks before your exams, right? But there's one big mistake that I see a lot of students make when doing this. They start preparing for their exams earlier, which is great, but because their exams are so far away, they begin pseudo-studying. So pseudo-studying is when you just sit there with your laptop or textbook open and you're studying, but you're not really thinking about what you're studying. You're just studying to feel like you're being productive rather than actually studying with your exams in mind. A continuing theme throughout this video and throughout any of my Study Smarter videos is you need to be actively studying. So always asking questions, always linking new ideas with information that you already know, and rewriting your notes rather than just copying straight from the textbook, those kind of things. The 60-second review. The 60-second review is an incredibly useful activity that can be used pretty much anywhere. So during a lecture, just after it's finished and everyone is packing up, or even just before everyone is packing up, take 60 seconds to write a couple of sentences summarizing the main 2 or 3 points of what you just learned in the lecture. It should only take about 60 seconds or so, but it's a phenomenally effective use of that 60 seconds because you're forcing your brain to recall and process the main 2 or 3 points in the lecture, therefore you're cementing that knowledge into your brain by moving it from your short-term memory over to your long-term memory. And if you can carry out this 60-second activity after every lecture and you turn it into a habit, although it only takes 60 seconds, over the course of the semester, it can have a massive compounding result in terms of the information that you're actually able to retain from your lectures. A slightly different version to this is actually to jot down a couple of points from the lecture that you feel was the least clear, that you didn't really understand that well. Again, this shouldn't take more than 60 seconds, but it will help you identify the gaps in your knowledge, and that right there is the first thing to fixing them. You see, when you're studying smart, you're constantly analysing how you're learning and what you're learning. You're always trying to find flaws in your study strategy, and you're always trying to find gaps in your knowledge. I use this same principle when I'm reading a non-fiction book. So for example, I read How to Become a Straight A Student by Cal Newport years ago, about 2016, just as I was preparing to start my university bachelor's course, which by the way, I would highly recommend the book if you are a student. But just recently, I reread the book summary on this video sponsor short form, and instead of having to read the entire book again, it only took me about 10 minutes to read the book summary, and it refreshed almost everything that I learned when I read the book 7 or so years ago. And what I've noticed is short form very cleverly use quite a few speed learning methods. So for example, the How to Become a Straight A Student has a one-page summary of the entire book, but they also have actionable steps throughout, which the actual book doesn't have. They have really smart analysis and additional points that short form's authors had added themselves. And I think most importantly, they have exercises which you can complete and submit, so you're actively engaged when you're reading rather than just passively reading. And you guys know how strongly I feel about active studying as opposed to passive studying. They have non-fiction books from loads of different genres, including education, productivity, and self-improvement. I've been using short form for more than a year now, and you can too, with 5 days of unlimited access and an additional 20% discount on your annual subscription by going to shortform.com/productelon or by clicking on the link in the description. Narrow your focus. This is great for two types of students: the students that are particularly lazy or demotivated, and the students that are striving to study as efficiently as possible. So narrowing your focus means just studying the things that will actually affect your final grade. The Pareto principle, also known as the 80-20 rule, suggests that 80% of outcomes result in 20% of the causes. So for example, it's very likely that 80% of the grades that you achieve come from 20% of your studying. So you need to prioritize this 20%, but what exactly does that mean? When you're studying, there are those tasks that you'll be doing that are not that important, right? They won't directly help you with your final exams, and this is the 80% of your studying. These tasks can include background reading from your textbook or completing homework assignments from your lecture. Then there are the tasks that you do that directly affect your grades, and this is the 20% of your studying that you need to prioritize. And this involves answering past paper questions and consolidating and summarizing lecture notes in preparation for your revision. Your brain can only retain a certain amount of information before over time it starts to forget it, right? So a late 19th century German psychologist Hermann Ebbinghaus dubbed this the forgetting curve. So if you're trying to make your studying as efficient as possible, it's important that you spend more time focusing on the material that will directly affect your exam paper, and this often means that you don't need to read whole entire textbooks, but rather just focus on areas that you think will be in the exam. Spread out your studying. Now, this is such a simple concept, but it's so incredibly underutilized. So if your exams or just your education in general is stressing you out, then this is for you. The vast majority of students, when their semester first starts, the number of hours they're studying will be relatively low, right? As the semester progresses and their exams get closer, the number of hours studying will steadily increase, and then 1 or 2 weeks before the exam, their studying will suddenly increase even more as the pressure from the exams motivate them to start cramming in preparation. And that's maybe how you study, it's how most students study, but it's just not studying smart. It's quite a stressful way of approaching your exams, and at least in my opinion, there is a better and smarter way of doing it. So what I would do is at the beginning of the semester, I would set a goal of the number of hours that I was going to study every day. Now that could be 6 hours, it could be 8 hours, it could be 10 hours. It's really up to you, but just make sure that whatever you choose, you can maintain it throughout the whole semester. So for me, it was studying 8 hours a day. I treated university like a full-time job, so 8 hours was perfect. And at the beginning of the semester, it would often be background reading of the new material, going through past papers to get an idea of what I'm going to be learning about in lectures, and watching documentaries and YouTube videos about the new subject, just to have a broad and basic foundational understanding of the subject. You see, at this point, no one else will be putting in much studying. There's no exam deadline for months to come, so most people don't have the pressure of an exam to motivate them to study. So this is where you get ahead of most other students. And because there's no pressure of deadlines, it's a relatively stress-free way of studying. And it can be fun too. Watching documentaries and watching YouTube videos on the subject topic can be an engaging way of introducing yourself into a new subject. Now, this is where it gets interesting. As you progress through the semester, your 8 hours of studying stays the same. Where most other students have to increase the number of hours they study because they need to catch up, you don't. You stick to your 8 hours throughout the middle of the semester and even just before the exams. There were so many exams that I had approaching where I just didn't have to increase my studying in order to prepare for them. Create a daily 4-hour deep work habit. Training myself to be able to enter into a flow state when studying was one of the most powerful things I did at university. So remember the last time you were so focused with the task that you were doing that you forgot to take breaks, you forgot to eat, you were just so focused and in the zone. But more importantly, it's this effortless, streamlined kind of productivity where you're in a flow state, it feels good, it feels like you can just keep going and going forever. Now imagine being able to switch on this level of concentration and focus whenever you study, almost like flicking on a light switch. Suddenly your studying becomes an enjoyable experience, something that you actually like doing, and studying 10, 11 hours a day is just not a big deal anymore. So learning how to use deep work to study smarter is absolutely essential. And Cal Newport's book, Deep Work, suggests setting aside the morning, such as 7 a.m. to 11 a.m. for deep work before jumping into shallow work, which is exactly what I do now. I'm by far at my most productive in the morning, so I take advantage of this time and I make sure that I go to a distraction-free place, usually a coffee shop in the morning, and I get at least 4 hours of deep work in where I'm completely absorbed in a task. And that task, more often than not, is writing. And speaking of writing, the next step is self-imposed time constraints. Are you someone that completes your assignment 1 week before the deadline or even the day of the deadline? Because it's quite common where, and I'm sure that we've been in this situation before, where we won't be motivated to write an assignment until the day of the deadline, and we only become motivated as a direct result of the deadline looming. So what I've noticed is that if I have 2 weeks to write an assignment, it will usually take me 2 weeks to write that assignment. However, if I have only 24 hours to write that assignment, then I'll have it written within 24 hours. It's essentially Parkinson's law in action that states work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. So I would use this to my advantage. At university, if the due date for an assignment was the 30th of September, for example, then I'd make my own deadline for 1 week before that, so the 23rd of September. Firstly, I'd have the assignment written with 7 days to spare, but I'd also procrastinate far less and work a lot harder and a lot faster because I knew I had a shorter period of time to write it. Even to this day, I still have deadlines for pretty much everything that I do. It's quite an easy way to kind of trick your brain into working with urgency, therefore increasing productivity quite significantly. There are so many kind of small strategies like that that significantly cut my studying time right down because I was studying smarter rather than harder. In fact, I made a video on it last year on how to study smarter, not harder, where I talk about a load of other strategies that you can use to streamline your studying. It's actually one of my most popular videos with 1.4 million views. You can click on the card on the screen to watch that. And I've also compiled a playlist of all my study smarter and harder videos. If you watch all of those videos, you'll be able to process information a lot faster. And finally, do check out this video's sponsor, Short Form, link in the description below.